If you clicked on this video, you're probably already aware of the now legendary encounter between the computer programs AlphaZero and Stockfish 8 a few years back. And you probably already know that there were very few games in which AlphaZero was defeated, and in fact there were even fewer games where AlphaZero blundered a drawn position and gave the win to Stockfish within a single move. I could only find 2 such instances, and the interesting thing I found was that it was in the same endgame, bishops and rooks. So I'm going to show you both positions where AlphaZero blundered. So in this first position we're going to look at, AlphaZero goes wrong with the move king to b3. It's a losing move. What was necessary was g takes h5. And after g takes h5, you might be thinking, hasn't black just helped white improve his pawn structure? Well, yes, that's true, but more importantly, this bishop now has access to f5, which wasn't the case in the game. So you could see some moves like this, and h6 can be played, h7, but eventually the rook and the bishop will be able to participate in stopping that pawn. Let's contrast that with the game. King to b3, h6 is played. Now this rook has the sole duty of coming back here to stop the pawn. We go rook c1, c2. It looks a little scary, but white's rook and bishop are coordinated well to prevent that pawn from promoting. So white plays h7, the rook goes to h8. If you were to try rook c8, rook h1 can even be played. King b2, and we'll just get our queen. Rook takes, Black can get the queen, but after this, white's the exchange up with an extra pawn. It's a winning endgame. So that's not working out. So the rook goes in front of the pawn, and then the rook goes behind the pawn. The king starts to come in, and then what white wants to do is infiltrate with the king. And white is going to be able to force that to happen. King d3 played. Now we got rook to h2. Black is getting into a zugzwang kind of a position here. If you just try to move the bishop around, white breaks through with this move e6, giving the king a route to come in. So you don't really want to allow e6, but it's not really preventable. King c3 here in the game, king e4, and after something like this, bishop c4 check was played, just giving up that pawn. You could try bishop b3. Again, I think e6 is just immediately decisive. If the bishop takes here, then the king can take here. And the king is going to be able to infiltrate one way or another. If the computer gives this move, you try to move the bishop around. I think, yeah, what we do is we end up getting this bishop over here to this diagonal, and then it's just over. Yeah, you can't, there's just too many ways to force the promotion of that pawn. So white wins. So in this next position we're going to look at, AlphaZero is again black, and as you can see it's the same endgame, bishops, rooks, and white even has passed h-pawns, just like before. So AlphaZero goes wrong with the move king to c7. The king is headed the wrong direction. It needs to go towards the h-file to help defend. That way if rook h6 is played to help the pawn advance, there's king f7. You try this, king g7, it's just a dead draw. The king is going to help defend against the h-pawns advancing, but here, rook h6, it's a little different. The king's way over here, and we get h5. And then AlphaZero has this little tricky bishop e2 check, giving up the f2 pawn, but then bishop takes h5, a discovered check, which wins one of those h-pawns, but unfortunately white has 2, so here comes the other one, h4. And now rook h2, getting behind the pawn, it's a good move, and the king starts to infiltrate. What we end up seeing is the king coming up to here. White doesn't even care about giving up the d-pawn, because the active king is more important. We check the black king, and then AlphaZero plays rook d7, which would have made things really easy for Stockfish if it would have played rook takes d7. I don't know why it didn't play that move, because after king takes, king d5, now the king is coming in. This pawn needs to be defended. The bishop should probably stay on this diagonal to stop this pawn. So let's say there's a check. Maybe the king goes here. Bishop g4, but the king is just going to infiltrate and guide this pawn in. If you try to bring this king over like this, there's king e6, and both of these squares are taken away from the king. You just start moving the bishop around again, king f6, and you're just going to guide that pawn in. What can black really even do here? Let's say you make some bishop move. Well, we go to g6, and the king is still cut off. This pawn's just going to march forward. It's a very nice position. This pawn is actually kind of a problem for black. Black would like to help maybe defend this way, But yeah, it's not working. That would have been really easy for Stockfish, but instead Stockfish goes for bishop a5 check, which I think is still winning, but it just makes things take a little bit longer. And we have this situation where, okay, the pawn keeps moving, h6, and then the king is here. And I think eventually what white wants to do is get this bishop on the diagonal to watch over b4, because the king doesn't want to have to babysit, and white doesn't really want black getting too much counterplay by advancing that pawn. So you can see what happens. Eventually, yeah, bishop e7, and now the king's free to come this way. And then the black king starts to try to come over. But this move hitting the rook has to stay on this file, or else this pawn will be able to promote, so it goes back, and then the king infiltrates, and the black king's just too far away. And I think in here, AlphaZero gives up the b pawn and then resigns. So I thought that was very interesting. It's probably worth noting that both of these positions occurred after move number 100. I think this one started at 104, and the other one I think was even higher, like 130 something. So that might have something to do with the fact that AlphaZero couldn't see deeply enough to see that it was losing, because maybe both engines were getting short on time. So hope you enjoyed that. Like and subscribe for more videos related to computer chess in the near future.